Welcome, lights, camera, action. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's session on 3 council strategies for eliminating subminimum wage, approaches to eliminating the use of 14C in 3 states. For 83 years, the 14C exemption from minimum wage protections has been used to legally pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. Winning the battle to end subminimum wage practice is a mandatory step to full inclusion of people with disabilities in our society. Not only does it reflect the true value of work, but it enables all people of all abilities the guaranteed wages they need to live a fuller life with the goal of an eventual financial security society and be self-sufficient. While Congress does have promising legislation to change this, it is clear that several states are done waiting and are taking the lead to address this form of discrimination. It is my honor to introduce this breakout session that focuses on how 3 states, Maryland, Colorado, and Hawaii, have taken the initiative to end this discrimination and work to change state laws. Take it away, Rachel. Of the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm Rachel London, the Executive Director of the Maryland DD Council. I'm just going to quickly go over the objectives for today and then turn it over to my esteemed colleague also in Maryland. So today we're going to understand systems change efforts to eliminate subminimum wage. And like Nicole said, you're going to hear from 3 states and the efforts in Maryland, Hawaii, and Colorado. You're going to understand how we collaborated with people with developmental disabilities, families, providers, state agencies, policymakers, and others to address concerns and barriers and to promote more opportunities. And finally, we're going to understand how we created policies and practices that support people to work and have meaningful days when they're not working. I am now going to turn it over to Ken Capone, the Public Policy Director of People on the Go of Maryland. Ken?
Good afternoon. My name is Ken Capone. I am the Public Policy Director for People on the Go, which is Maryland's statewide self-advocacy organization. At People on the Go of Maryland, we educate, advocate, and legislate for all individuals with disabilities. We sit on state and national committees. We present to local school children about what self-advocacy means for everyone. We collaborate with other organizations around important issues. We hold monthly board meetings and conduct quarterly meetings with our members and much more. We spend time around the state making sure people understand their rights and responsibilities. Slide 3. We have a problem in this country. Well, there are many problems, but I'm going to talk about one big problem for people with disabilities, which is paying people with disabilities subminimum wages. It is hard to believe that today in 2021, the antiquated practice of paying people with disabilities subminimum wages still occurs. I see this as a threefold problem: outdated laws, employer myths, and the education system. First problem, the outdated law known as Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act, enacted in 1938. This law allows for public and private employers to obtain special certificates from the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division that allow them to compensate workers with disabilities at rates below the current federal or state minimum wage based on time studies. Many people feel this law should stay in place because of safety reasons for people with disabilities. Many parents who want their loved ones to be safe, and they think a segregated workshop is the safest place for them. Yes, we all want to be safe, Just because I want to be safe doesn't mean I can't work with the general public and the community. Second problem, we have employers who are afraid to hire people with disabilities. A myth is providing accommodations for people with disabilities is expensive, but the fact is the majority of workers with disabilities do not need accommodations to perform their jobs, and for those who do, the cost is usually minimal. According to the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, a service from the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, 57% of accommodations cost absolutely nothing to make, while the rest typically cost only $500. Moreover, tax incentives are available to help employers cover the costs of accommodations, as well as modifications required to make their businesses accessible to persons with disabilities. Third problem I feel is our education system does a disservice to persons with disabilities by not preparing them for the real world and educating them in segregated environments. Many times the school system put people with disabilities on a certificate track instead of a diploma track, which limits people with disabilities tremendously in the workforce and getting a post-secondary education. Slide 4. How did Maryland decide to move forward to phase out subminimum wages? People on the go of Maryland were having talks with stakeholders 2 years prior to 2016 about submitting legislation to end subminimum wage. There was a lot of legwork done before we decided the time was right to submit legislation. People on the go discussed with the membership the need to have the same rights as everyone else. Understanding that our civil rights were being violated and helped us to explain this issue. We surveyed our members to get an understanding of where their interest in phasing out 14C lied. The survey concluded. The survey found that our members and people who were being paid subminimum wage were in favor of eliminating 14C. They were in favor of learning what options they would have in the job opportunities to make more money. Slide 5. The Equal Employment Act is important because as of July 1st, 2016, there were many Maryland residents with disabilities paid subminimum wages by 41 providers. There was a study conducted in 2001 by the Government Accountability Office found that only approximately 5% of people in 14C placements transition into community-based jobs. We learned in Maryland that people who were in sheltered workshops, on average only spent 2 hours a week in them. The rest of their week they spent in the community doing other activities. Slide 6. Why networking is so important. In 2016, Maryland General Assembly passed the Capone Equal Employment Act. This law came to be when moving. The process of moving this bill from an idea to a law took a strong collaborative effort with visionary leaders. This law came to be when self-advocates having a dream for equal access and opportunities to fair wages shared their stories of sheltered work and subminimum wage with their legislators. People on the go of Maryland obtained 2 strong legislators to sponsor the legislation. We also wheeled the blueback around the legislature to get co-sponsors for the legislation. The legislators were so stunned by this practice most quickly agreed to support a legislative action and co-sponsor the legislation to change the practice. We had some legislators that didn't want the phase out of sheltered workshops to happen. Maryland's statewide self-advocacy group, People on the Go of Maryland, the National Federation of Blind, Autistic Self-Advocates Network, along with support from the Maryland chapter of the Association of Persons Supporting Employment First, APS, chapter in the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council, worked with legislators to propose a bill that would end to the use of subminimum wage in Maryland. After the bill was drafted, other statewide organizations groups joined in the discussion. Some were very supportive, while others had members that were not as supportive of the controversial legislation, as it would mean a significant change in practice for some providers. Through a great deal of negotiation in a very short period of time, the mediation, primarily led by self-advocates, moved from opposition to agreement, and the bill was sent to committee. Most of the collaborators spoke favorably at the hearings, but there was still dissension among some members. Each member of the consortium spent time meeting with those in opposition, listening to their concerns and attempting to address them. Ultimately, the Maryland General Assembly passed the bill with measures that require a great deal of tracking and accountability of the state agencies to share how people in sheltered work are moving into community employment. The leadership clearly came from the self-advocates who positioned themselves as the primary leaders in the process. Slide 7. What does the Equal Employment Act do? It prohibits new 14C certificates from being authorized to any organizations that doesn't currently hold a certificate. Created a set of benchmarks and desired outcomes for each year of the phase-out to ensure people with disabilities are given the opportunity for employment in the community and of their choosing. Created a partnership of stakeholders that will create a strategic plan to phase out the use of 14C certificates. Slide 8. Benchmark highlights. In January 2017, there were 31 Maryland providers with registered 14C certificates. The active certificate's status depends on the expiration date of the 14C certificate. 14C certificates expire every 2 years. In 2017, all registered 14C certificates were scheduled to expire within the year. Under Maryland law, the providers are legally allowed to renew their 14C certificate until October 1st, 2020. In the 2018 report, the number of 14C certificate providers has reduced from 41 providers to 23 providers. Of the 23 14C certificate providers, 18 14C certificates were in active use and 4 not in active use. The 2019 Maryland 14C certificates expired and not renewed as 19 providers. The 4 remaining providers' certificates will expire on October 1st, 2020. On October 1st, 2020, we had 0 providers using 14C certificates. You might be thinking, what are people who were in a workshop doing now? As you know, it's a process. Some people found community integrated employment. Others are exploring options through a job development and discovery tools through provider services. And some are retired and are enjoying activities in their communities with their peers. Slide 9. We have had several states contact us and ask how we phased subminimum wage out legislatively in our state, which is one of the reasons I am here today. First, it takes self-advocates who are tired of their civil rights being violated and want to do something about it. It takes time to make a plan. It takes collaboration with many groups. It takes a lot of education of many different groups. And most importantly, it takes determination to get this done. Thank you. Now I will hand it back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Ken, very much. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing another one of the major leaders in the effort in Maryland, Senator Jeff Waldstreicher. And I hope he doesn't mind. I'm going to digress a little bit from the formal bio and tell you that he was elected to the Senate in 2018, but has served many terms, 4 terms actually, in the General Assembly. And more importantly, he is not only a champion for equality, but a particular champion for people with disabilities, and stood right by our side and led the effort in Maryland to pass the Equal Employment Act, as you just heard Ken say. And he is an attorney by trade, but really, again, maybe more importantly, Senator, also a sibling, and has done more work with us as the Maryland Council. A couple of years ago as the keynote speaker for our 2nd annual sibling conference. And we are thankful for your partnership, Senator, and everything that you've done for Marylanders, especially Marylanders with disabilities. So I am now going to introduce Senator Jeff Waldstreicher.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today and joining us in this breakout session. Let me start with something Rachel touched on. This issue is personal to me. My sister Marcy has a developmental disability, and she's very kind to allow me to speak candidly about her and her disability as we make policy here in Maryland and across the country. And so I come to this issue with kind of 3 things: my personal connection, my deep interest in the policy, and just a strong sense of passion for equal rights for everyone, especially for people with disabilities. But I think what we learned through the process, and this is what is really key, this is one of the things I want to convey to each and every one of you, is whether it's a personal connection, an ideological interest, or even a strong passion, that's not enough to get you across the finish line when it comes to passing major legislation, whether it's here in Annapolis or in state capitals across the country. What you really need, and Ken touched on this so eloquently, in addition to your personal connection and your ideological interest and your personal passion, you need relationships. You need relationships with the legislators who will ultimately make this decision. And those relationships need to be based on the coin of the realm in politics, which is trust. I'm going to sound like a kind of an old man here, but there's been so much great advocacy and passion over the past year or so after, for example, the murder of George Floyd. And what will be so key for all of the advocates on so many of these issues, all of the folks who are out in the street marching, which I really admire and was proud to be a part of as well, is to turn that energy into legislation through building of relationships and creating trust. And there is no more important relationship than that between the sponsor of a bill and the advocates behind the bill. So for example, in our case, it was such a pleasure working with Ken in his self-advocacy and Rachel and others to move this bill forward. I knew at any time that whatever Ken was doing, I didn't have to worry about it. I trusted him to see this through. I knew when he made remarks, I'd never have to worry about what would come out of his mouth. I knew when Rachel was behind the scenes advocating with other legislators, I never had to worry about what would come out of those meetings. I trusted them, and very kindly, they trusted me. And that was part of the success in moving this legislation forward. One of the key relationships and one of the most important parts of building trust that a lot of folks don't think about is in most states, just like Maryland, bills can begin on both sides simultaneously. So on the House of Representatives side, or in our case, we call it House of Delegates, and on the state Senate side. And so the relationship between your Senate sponsor and your House sponsor is extremely important. And in this case, I had a wonderful, wonderful friend and mentor in Senator Dolores Kelly, who was the Senate sponsor. And same thing, I knew that I could entrust her with moving the bill through the Senate as I was working hard with advocates moving the bill through the House. And that innate trust just made everyone feel comfortable and provided the momentum behind the bill. And of course, there has to be trust between advocates who advocate on behalf of people with disabilities and advocates who have disabilities, self-advocates. And unless you have everyone at the table, the legislation will go south very quickly. A big, wide, inclusive, diverse table is one of the most important things you can have when building a movement to pass legislation. And so having everyone there was really key. And I'm sure my colleagues in Colorado and Hawaii will agree. You know, there's a saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That's very much true in a lot of different cases and would have been true here on this bill. But fortunately, we were able to get everyone at the table and everyone moving in the same direction. So one last shout out here to Rachel London. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your leadership on this legislation. And Ken Capone, Ken, this bill would not have become law without you. Your advocacy, your self-advocacy was key to what we did. And I'm so thankful for you and all that we've accomplished together. I tell you what, I'm having so much fun here, but from time to time, you know, it's late at night, I can't sleep. And I just think about the strangest things. And, you know, the other night I was thinking about my obituary. I'm sorry to get morbid on you, but thinking, you know, if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, what would they write? And I know that the Ken Capone Equal Employment Act would be at the top of the list. And I'm so incredibly proud of that. So incredibly heartened that we accomplished this together. So thank you again to all of you. Thank you to my colleagues in Colorado and Hawaii who made this happen in their states. And Brianna, I don't know if you can put up that photo that Ken had at the signing ceremony, but if you're looking to bring this to other states and other legislators, just show them this photo. Look how packed it is, how happy everyone is, Democrats and Republicans together, all joining to support and sign this bill. This photo really encapsulates all that was great about the movement we had to pass this legislation. And it is certainly my prayer that we do so in other states. Thank you all very much once more.
Senator Waldstreicher, thank you again for joining us and for your leadership. And I just want to add something that neither Ken nor the senator mentioned, is that this bill passed in the first year that we introduced it. For all of the reasons both Ken and Senator mentioned, the collaboration, the partnership, bringing all the people to the table, whether proponents or opponents, probably very importantly, the opponents too, were at the table, and not that we left the table in agreement, but we all came to the table for that discussion. And much like other states, I assume, it's pretty unheard of for something so huge in Maryland that it's going to pass in the first year on the first try. And I think that's a real testament to all of the advocates, those within state government and in the state legislature, and those of us that are not. So thank you again, Senator. We're going to switch gears a little bit and end Maryland's presentation with sort of the so what for the council, and how did we take the next steps, and how do we use not only our advocacy efforts and our systems change through advocacy, like you've just heard from Ken and Senator Waldstreicher, but how do you use that second part of all of the work that we do, our grant funding, to really support the effort that was put in place? So the Maryland DD Council acted very quickly after the Equal Employment Act passed and ended up funding for many years, and I will go into details in just a minute, what we have affectionately referred to as TIP grants, transforming and improving practices through customized technical assistance. Next slide, please. And so what we did was, we now had this legislation that said in the next 4 years, we were going to close sheltered workshops. There was going to be no more subminimum wage. And we had to do all of these things to improve employment outcomes, to improve meaningful days for people when they're not working. And we wanted to help, right? The council wanted to help. So the goal of the TIP grants were to improve the way people were supported to work and have meaningful days when they weren't working. And what the TIP grants did was fund technical assistance by subject matter experts. We shortened a RFP process with very specific questions that sort of gauged where community service providers were in supporting people to work and have meaningful days, and where they were in developing policies within their organizations and agencies, and how our funding for technical assistance could help them. In addition, we required all of those community service providers that were part of the TIP grants to be part of a learning community. So they would come together monthly and talk about lessons learned and challenges and barriers and the good, and share those stories to support one another. Next slide. And so what did we do? How did we make that happen? Excuse me. So we partnered with a statewide nonprofit called Maryland Works, and their mission is to expand employment and business ownership opportunities for people with disabilities. They are not a DD specific organization. They are an employment and business ownership for all people with disabilities organization. And that partnership lasted, that funding partnership, of course, we are still partners, lasted 4 years. So over the course of the 4 years that we phased out some minimum wage in Maryland, we issued 4 different annual requests for proposals and funded almost $408,000. So you see about $274,000 was council funding. The rest of the funding was money that we leveraged from Maryland Works to support 42 providers to change the way they were providing support to people so that more people were employed or having meaningful days. There were a variety of activities done. Not everything resulted in closing sheltered workshops. Not everything resulted in people being employed. Sometimes it was focused on meaningful days. Sometimes, and you'll see on the next slide, it was focused on transitioning youth and pre-employment transition services. So we took the approach, what we did was made $10,000 available to each provider that applied. We didn't tell them who to hire, though we could recommend people. We didn't tell them what to do. They were selected based on an overview of the challenges that they were facing and the outcomes that they wanted to see. Next slide. So they did close sheltered workshops, and I have specifics in a few minutes. More people were absolutely employed over the 4 years. Even more people were having meaningful days who had not been prior to the grant. A lot of attitudes changed. So there was a lot of work with people that were supported, families, staff, and board members to increase knowledge and understanding, to change attitudes and beliefs about what people can and can't do during the day, whether that's work or some other activity that was meaningful to them. Next slide. So what happened in our 4 years? So with our grant funding, this is the total of all 4 years. 8 sheltered workshops closed as a direct result of the technical assistance that we funded. 237 people were now employed in competitive employment in their communities. 403 people were now engaged in more meaningful community activities when they weren't working. And 13 students received competitive employment while they were in school so that they would transition into a community provider with that job. So as I said before, we were able to support 42 community service providers over the 4 years. And they, in turn, those 42 community service providers were able to talk to partner, to better educate community employers about the skills and abilities of people with developmental disabilities. And that was another way. So even if people were not getting jobs as a result of these grants, those increased partnerships and that increased skill and that increased understanding and knowledge about people with developmental disabilities and the work will and has since led to even more employment. So we expect very much so to continue to see more and more outcomes as a result of our funding and the technical assistance that was provided. Next slide. I also wanted to just let you know one other thing that we did, and while there was a lot of others, these are the 2 that I chose to focus on. We issued a publication about halfway through, so in 2018, 2019, called What Matters. And it's the story of 9 people talking about what matters in their lives. And what we did and how we sort of guided this work, and the writer and the photographer, was based on the learning communities and the other groups that we were involved with, the other committees, councils, whatever they were. There were a lot of lessons learned, right, about things that were scary to people, whether that be family members or staff or the provider themselves or employers in the community. And we listened and we took all of that and found 9 stories that demonstrated things like dignity of risk, or what do you do when you're in when you have 1 staff to 4 people and they want to all have meaningful days, or what do you do when for people with significant disabilities who are struggling to find a job or have medical support needs that maybe employers are not aware of. And so these stories reflect all of the issues and concerns that we had been hearing. And, they really do show what life can look like. And it's not all happy stories, right? There are struggles and the stories show, but in the end, they were successful in working or having meaningful days when they're not working. I'm happy on next slide. The next slide has the link to our website, the publication, because we also heard that not everybody's going to read a whole publication, though it's very pretty. Each individual story may speak to someone or may need to be used separately to really show whomever someone's working with, whether that be the person that they're supporting or the family that's really struggling with one particular issue that only one story is going to address. So we also have them available in each story individually, and sort of they're almost like one-pager fact sheets, but it's the story itself, so that it's not overwhelming for people. So those are just 2 strategies that the council used to support all of the advocacy we did, our partners did after, the Equal Employment Act passed. And as we continue in Maryland to work towards employment first and the outcome that more people are working and have meaningful days when they're not working. Thank you. I think the next slide and this is just my contact information. I think the next slide, I'm going to pass it now over to Daintry in Hawaii.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was awesome. I could see I have a lot of work ahead of me to get this thing implemented. Hey folks, I'm Daintry Bartoldus, Executive Administrator for Hawaii State Council on Developmental Disabilities. In this past legislative session, we just passed our elimination of the 14C waivers. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we went about and got that done. So as you've heard from Rachel, educating policymakers is the master key that all DD councils hold. It is so important to make sure our legislators understand what we want and why we want it. For several years, the DD Council educated the policymakers on the 14C waivers, why it should be eliminated, what it's doing, how archaic it is. And time after time, the legislators asked us for information, we'd provide it. We're told by legislators we have to be ready on the go. We have to be able to answer these questions. And so we're ready. We're very excited. We figured we had all of our ducks in the row this year. And so as the Senate heard the bill, the House did not, which kind of alarmed us. And we thought, oh no, but being that it was a COVID year, we figured they're limited bills and we thought for sure this is going to go over. Then we heard the House say we're not going to hear the bill, which totally alarmed us. So first thing I did was freaked out a little bit and called Brett Williams and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe we had all this information. What else do we do? So our colleagues are so important to us. So he was a great sounding board for me. He provided me more information because the legislators wanted to know more about the discrimination of it, which looked pretty straightforward to us, but they wanted more. And then we were able to meet with the House chair, which is Representative Onishi, who at first, before the session, said he's going to hear our bill, no problem, but then changed his mind. Here in Hawaii, everybody is really connected. People seem to be related to everybody. True story, a delegate of his colleagues contacted him and said, my sister's, auntie's, cousin's, next door neighbor's best friend's son works at Safeway. And if this passes, he's going to get fired. And we're going to send him down to your office because he won't have a place to go. And he said, I cannot battle this. So we were kind of taken back by the fact that at first he said he was, and then now he's asking for the thing. So we asked for a meeting with some of the head delegate chairs. And so we set up this meeting. So I went and I put my favorite blazer on, my lucky pearl necklace, and I said, okay. And I joined the Zoom room. And at first, they were kind of, we're going back and forth, but then they really narrowed it down for us. And they said, we need the council's help to tell us this is discriminatory, right? And we're like, absolutely, it's a civil rights issue. And we went over that and he said, that's all we need people to come in and say, it's a civil rights issue, it's discriminatory. Then nobody could fight it. I could stand up to any colleague and argue that one point. And that will get it through. So that's what we did. We went out and got ourselves advocates. We advocated and just kept that message very precise and clear. It went through the House, went through conference, the floor vote on the House and the Senate side unanimously passed. And we're so excited. So this slide, I only have 2 slides, just shows you what the name of the bill was. The representative, again, is going for the discrimination point, the Senate. And then when it went to the governor's desk, he had a bill signing ceremony and highlighted that specific point about being discriminatory. So that's how here in Hawaii, we're able to end the 14C subminimum wage, get that out of law. So thank you so much. And from there, I'm going to kick it over to Robert, who's going to carry on. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Daintry. Yeah, Colorado, it's fascinating hearing the description of what Maryland and Hawaii have gone through with this, and there are many similarities to what Colorado has done. I'm Bob Lawhead. You'll see Robert on the screen, but I'm policy advisor for the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council. Have been around in the system here in Colorado for 40 years, trying to eliminate subminimum wage and assist people in their efforts to become competitively employed in regular community jobs. So we approached it a little differently than Maryland and Hawaii in that we realized at first that we didn't have all we needed to have in the system to be able to deal with making sure people were able to transition out of subminimum wage jobs, sheltered workshop jobs, and into real competitive employment. And so we started with a more general concept, and that was employment first. So as we started to consider this, what became basically a 5-6 year effort, we realized that we were ready to go on this because we had set the groundwork for many years in trying to reduce the use of subminimum and sheltered employment, and really advocated for the expansion of supported employment. As a result, we had many of those sheltered workshop service providers at least considering that it might make sense to move forward with getting rid of those legacy models and moving toward regular community employment. Additionally, we had a history of supported employment expansion success in the 90s. We hit a blip as the century turned, and after being number 2 in the nation in the percentage of people being served by the state with intellectual and developmental disabilities, number 2 as far as the percentage of people employed in regular employment, we started to go in the wrong direction. And so those 15 years after 2000 provided a lot of motivation, as we saw a lot of our former gains where people were competitively employed and enjoying real work for real pay started to go down the tubes. So we basically, as we started to talk to self-advocates and family members and move this forward, as I mentioned, we realized that the capacity was not there in the service system, that service providers didn't, although they were saying that they knew how to assist people in their employment efforts, they really didn't know how to do best practice. And we also found that as a result, if we eliminated some minimum wage, people would simply be put into segregated day programs instead. And so this gets to some of those meaningful day issues that Rachel was talking about in Maryland. You can't just, as you move this forward, you can't allow people to simply go from sheltered work, sub-minimum wage work, into segregated day programs, or even as far as that goes, community-based day programs that tend to be congregate and don't really listen to what people are requesting those activities be, because you've got 5 or 6 people with a single staff person, and you just can't listen to what people really want if you're in a group, a congregate group of a bunch of people trying to figure this stuff out. We also really embraced the Employment First State Leadership Mentoring Program that was being sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor, Office of Disability Employment Policy. And that federal effort helped us in our initial efforts to get going on this. And so we initially, in 2016, ran legislation to run employment first so that we could develop that system capacity. I'm going to take you on a brief personal detour. I didn't mention that I have a son who has a label of Down syndrome and actually has a number of other labels as well. One of those labels is that he's considered untestable. So many people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities get an IQ test, and that gives them a label for the rest of their lives as to supposedly how disabled they are. Well, that's BS in my opinion. He also had a label of most challenging student at Boulder High School when he was in high school. within the special ed department. Now, these kinds of labels are damaging to people and do nothing more than harm people. But as a result of those labels, when Jess's mother and I talked to school personnel about what his future was, they were talking in terms of segregated employment, subminimum wage, and segregated day programs, possibly doing some volunteering in the community. But the expectations for our son were just minimal. What we found is that as Jess went through high school in integrated classes, he had a homeroom that was segregated, but when he went out into regular integrated classes, he really shined as far as showing his social intelligence, joking around, making people laugh, interacting with people, being a good friend. And they also noticed that he really enjoyed some of the real integrated work experiences that he got at the very end of his high school career. What ended up happening is that Jess is now working at a pizzeria in Boulder. And, you know, he can't be understood by a lot of people when he talks to them, but I can tell you these pictures can tell you what's going on. This is a picture of basically him getting his first paycheck at the pizzeria. And he's a music freak and a video freak. So he uses that money for downloads. He also takes a lot of pride. As you can see, he's got some pizza boxes there in front of him. He is the prime pizza box folder at that pizzeria. And that is the primary task that he does during the day. And then of course he gets a free slice after every shift. So you can't beat that. He is a pizza fanatic. So bottom line, just as the senator talked about, I have personal feelings about this, and it really makes a lot of difference. What we did in 2016, Senate Bill 16-077 was the Employment First for People with Disabilities bill. And within that legislative declaration, we had a variety of things pointed out. The value of work, the fact that there were structural barriers in place that were preventing people with disabilities from being employed in regular employment. That we wanted to get a basic understanding that without best practice service guidance, and these are things like customized employment, discovery assessment, individual placement and support model. These are some of the characteristics of best practice that our state wasn't doing at all. And so the premise was we've got to build these things in. Olmstead compliance. Number of hands of people who know Olmstead. I know Nicole does. But I'll tell you, Olmstead was the basis for this. And again, it gets to what Daintry was talking about. It's a civil rights issue. And once you clarify that this is a civil rights issue and that people have a right to be integrated within regular community settings, including regular community job settings, the sell to other people becomes easier. We added free market principles because, quite frankly, we had to make sure that both sides of the aisle were interested in this. And so, as a number of people have already said, collaboration and making sure that the interests of all people are included. You know, this is common sense, and so I'm not going to go through this slide except to say we know that work matters for all of us, and there's a variety of reasons that it's directly connected to our health, to our social well-being, and to the development of friendships outside of work. Basically, employment first, its foundation again is Olmstead. That and the detail on this is that when people utilize state and local funding to provide services, then those services have to be provided in the most integrated setting possible. And quite frankly, almost all the states are in violation of this. I wanted to just bring your attention to one of the people who helped us pull this off. through all of his work. Clarence Miller it was a good friend of mine. We lost him in 2014. But here's a quote from Clarence. "I'm sick and tired of people trying to put me in sheltered workshops. Olmsted says people with disabilities have a right to work in the community. This is ridiculous." That is just so Clarence. He fought hard for this, and I just wished that he could have lived to have seen the bill actually done. Clarence was sometimes referred to as the 101st legislator in Colorado because we have 100 legislators, and then Clarence would deliver bills to the various legislators to make sure that they were communicating with each other with different bill versions. Next slide, please. Chester Finn, many of you know Chester, I'm sure, former president of Self Advocates Becoming Empowered of the USA. Here's a quote from Chester. "Other groups fighting for their civil rights would not stand for separate places, and neither should we." Well said, Mr. Finn. So the primary legislative points in this that basically set this foundation for us to be able to eliminate subminimum wage was to form this Employment First Advisory Partnership to develop a strategic plan with formal recommendations for change to the legislature. So each year, this group reports out to the General Assembly of Colorado on our findings, on our progress, and the fact that this was tied to ongoing reporting to the General Assembly gave this group, which I have co-chaired for the last 5 years, a fair amount of power and influence. These are various pieces, various quotes. CIE, competitive integrated employment, is the primary objective and preferred option. That's a standard in Employment First language. We were to identify barriers to competitive employment, identify conflicting rules and regulations and knowledge gaps and data gaps, and assure that pre-vocational services, which is typically run by sheltered workshops, were time limited, that people would not be stuck in those kinds of places forever. So basically, we got this legislation done because, again, those relationships that the senator had referred to, so important in getting this stuff done. Project Search in Colorado had a fair amount of success in 2015, 2016. The legislator who was the primary sponsor of this bill observed that, talked to some of the businesses involved. The initial group that worked on this was the local ARC in Larimer County, the ARC of Colorado, Colorado APSI, and the DD Council. And together, we formed the basis for the bill. Just as the examples that you heard from Rachel and Daintry, we then brought in essential collaborators to build community support after that initial draft bill. Statutory requirements were the premise that all people, and when we say all in Colorado, we mean all, including people like my son who have labels that may indicate to some people that he's unemployable. Well, that is just not true. And we wanted to make sure that that was a statutory piece within the bill, that people were to be employed in the general workforce, and that it was the first and preferred outcome for all working age persons with disabilities, regardless of level of disability. And so this partnership was established. And in order to keep the fiscal note down, which is a reference to how much the bill costs, we designated the existing State Rehab Council as the coordinator for these opportunities and efforts. So these are some of the, we had 5 different departments. These are the various departments that we had on this EFAP, this Employment First Advisory Partnership. We also included the National Association, which is a reference to APSI, made sure that we had advocates for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, made sure we had people with disabilities and self-advocates involved, families involved, and other community members who had no service agency affiliation involved in this. Persons with disabilities advocates, service providers, of course, also were involved, but we made sure that this was led by advocacy. So this is the mission: identify the barriers to competitive integrated employment, create a strategic plan, And then a critical piece for systems change was that we had an ongoing mission to continue to meet through the years to consider revisions to the plan and provide advice and expertise related to subsequent implementation of the plan. So again, this is that annual power that we had with the General Assembly, with the legislator, the state legislature. I included this slide in because this was the battle cry, January 6th. And, you know, it is our house. And by our, I mean those of us who are citizens who are committed to finding systemic change that provides for empowerment and self-determination and making real choices in community settings for all of us, including people with disabilities. So we passed the bill in 2016. This Employment First Advisory Partnership did its work in 2017. We came out with a strategic plan. And then the following year in 2018, we went ahead for further legislation. Part of the reason that I meant to mention earlier that we did the legislative piece as opposed to just working with the executive branch is that that's what we did in the 90s. We worked with the executive branch, we got people excited, we got leadership within the executive branch, within those departments excited, and then those leaders left and it all went down the tubes. And so we decided we're going to pass the Employment First legislation in 2016. We're going to come back and implement Employment First recommendations with Senate Bill 18145. This hit on job coaches who were untrained in our state prior to this, requiring certification or earning a certificate so we at least knew that they had some kind of competency out there as they were working with people to find real employment for real wages. Discovery assessment was added to the VR fee schedule, which had been a lot of resistance to that. But again, this is the best practice piece. And we, even although it wasn't my idea, but because we collaborated with service agencies, they even put in a piece that service agencies would be reimbursed for the cost of that training. And so service agencies are able to get their staff trained and even pay for the time the staff do the training through the legislation. And that, as you might imagine, helped more service providers commit to converting to best practice. Again, so we did that in 2018. Here comes the 2019 legislative session, and we're going to put money to it. So we were able to get a 2019 appropriation done that basically provided $7.2 million over 3 years to go into Employment First efforts, to build the system's capacity, to make sure that we were tracking data on actual outcomes, to make sure that job coaches were getting trained. It included the creation of an Office of Employment First, customized employment pilot. And I assume some of you know what customized employment is, but it is really the key when we talk about eliminating some minimum wage. If you can show people in your state that customized employment is being used, it really is the key that unlocks the door to employment for many people who may have significant barriers to employment that are related to disability. And customized employment and individual placement and support typically used for people with mental health challenges are key to this best practice if you're going to really get this done and make sure that people are just not going into dead-end day programs once subminimum wage is eliminated. And then we felt we were ready to jump off with 2021 legislation that was actually initially introduced in 2020, but because of the pandemic, nothing passed with any kind of fiscal note whatsoever in Colorado. And so we brought it back in the second year. We didn't get it done in the first year like some of the states that you've heard, but got it in the second. And so basically that bill, Senate Bill 21-039, eliminates subminimum wage employment, outlaws all new 14C jobs effective this last July 1. It basically requires that the service agencies who are still doing subminimum wage submit a plan to gradually reduce 14C so that basically so that the possible negative impact to the 400 plus people here in Colorado who have subminimum wage is minimized and we can get people into real jobs. All 14C certificates eliminated within 4 years. So July 1, 2025, we will have it done. So we're a little behind the other states you've heard about today, but we're doing this gradually. We made sure that benefits counseling was included. So additional safeguards for people. Medicaid buy-in is being expanded for people using home and community-based services. Job supervision, which is just a reference to those people who have such a significant disability that they may not be able to maintain their focus on the job, that a less qualified staff person who would just provide supervision and reminders to get back on the job is a position that we had approved, as opposed to the more highly trained, highly paid job coach. And we made sure that some of the annual funding restrictions were lifted for employment services so that as people create their service plan during the year, they don't have to worry about employment-related services. Those can be set aside and looked at as a different pot of money that isn't limited by that annual service plan limit. We ran out of time. As you may recall, this all started with Senate Bill 1677, which was the initial Employment First bill. It sunsets this year, except that during this same session, we were able to continue the Employment First Advisory Partnership and its systems change mission indefinitely. So we had a 5-year time limit. We're now going forward to make sure that subminimum wage and other enhancements to the service system are done for as long as it takes. It also adds a pilot for a hiring preference for people with disabilities for state employment. So part of that Employment First Advisory Partnership strategic plan, one of the central 8 goals is that Colorado needs to step up to the plate and be a model employer. And so this is part of the model employer piece, is that we want the state to give a hiring preference similar to what they do for veterans, military veterans, and give that same kind of preference to people with disabilities so that we can get increasing numbers of people with disabilities into state government using those state jobs as a jumping off point for their careers. And so we're very excited about that. We were able to get that attached to the reauthorization of the Employment First Advisory Partnership. However, this is a work in progress. We got the subminimum wage elimination, but we still need to see systems change within the employment service structure if we're going to make sure that we continue to be successful. I remind people that, and you've heard it already today, this is directly linked to the civil rights movement for people with disabilities, and that the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Olmstead ruling of the Supreme Court in 1999 are directly linked to these efforts in eliminating subminimum wage employment and promoting real, regular, competitive, integrated employment. Just as other civil rights movement haven't fully attained their goals, neither has the civil rights movement for people with disabilities when it comes to employment. This is an ongoing issue. So some of the lessons learned, as you've already heard, it's just so much the same as what happened in Maryland and Hawaii. Link your efforts to social justice, non-discrimination, and basic citizen rights. This is an issue that is civil rights, and as much as we can link this effort with those, that should facilitate our success. Of course, reference the benefit of employment for all people. That just goes without saying. We also presented cost benefit information to let public policymakers know that there have been decades actually of studies with a guy by the name of Rob Samara, who has shown that for every dollar that you put into supported employment and customized employment, the state benefits by about $1.50. But when you put that dollar into sheltered and segregated work, you get no return on investment whatsoever. As we've already said, collaborate with service agencies, disability rights organizations, state departments, your USED, your University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, the council, parents, everyone after the basic direction has been figured out. And seek a core group which has employment first values, which understands that this is a civil rights issue and that you need to push to get these changes made. Making sure that advocates are in the driver's seat and moving that piece ahead was just critically important for us here in Colorado. And as I've mentioned before, best practice. And just a couple of months ago, I don't know that people have seen it, but Lou Brown, we lost Lou Brown, who was just a extraordinary civil rights advocate for people with significant disabilities. If you haven't checked it out yet, check out When Ordinary Becomes Extraordinary, which tracks numerous people in Madison, Wisconsin, who were considered too disabled to be employed, and their successes through the years after being fully included in education and then moving into regular community life. So there's some references, and I wanted to, before I turn it over to Michael, I wanted to mention the family question that came up in the presentation before ours here. We knew we were going to get pushback from families, and one of the people listening earlier this afternoon had said, well, how do you get parents to buy in? As I've mentioned before, we had to make sure that we could answer that question. We had to make sure that we had benefits planning. We had to make sure that we built in what's referred to as DB 101, which is Disability Benefits 101, an online process to allow families and self-advocates to access what the impact of earnings is going to be on their benefits. Because of course, if people are going to lose their benefits, people are not going to want to become employed. And so you need that information. Information is power. And those benefit information pieces are just so very important. And then, as you've heard me say a number of times today, building the capacity within the system to be able to employ people once they come out of segregated subminimum wage employment was a critical question that families had. They were 5 years ago were saying, well, you take my son or daughter out of a sheltered workshop, where are they going to go? You guys don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to assist somebody in their employment efforts, particularly people with the most significant disabilities. And so over the last 5 years, we've tried to build that capacity, and it has resulted in us being able to move forward with 14C elimination here in Colorado. So with that, I would like to introduce my colleague who helped with this effort. We're going to go to questions after Michael gives you some of his experiences. Michael Hoover is a longtime Colorado self-advocate who testified in favor of Colorado's Senate Bill 21-039, Eliminate Subminimum Wage Employment Bill, this past spring. He presently serves on Colorado's Employment First Advisory Partnership. That's that group that I described to you that is pushing the envelope on doing systems change in employment in Colorado. Michael has been a member of that for the last couple of years, that group reports annually to the Colorado legislature on their progress. Michael also serves on the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council's Legislative and Public Policy Committee and is a past council member. Michael, are you ready to go on?
Ready.
Hi, I am Mike Hoover, and I have had a job since I was 17 and lived in Austin, Texas. I went to a vocational high school and learned many useful skills for future jobs. I got paid, but not minimum wage. Then I moved to Boulder, Colorado, where I attended an integrated school for the first time. I was introduced to several jobs in high school. I got paid a set amount, but not minimum wage. I was excited to get a better job after high school. I went to VOC rehab and they contracted with a job coach to find me a job. The job was at a bakery, and I was to have a CO worker help me at the job when I needed prompts. I knew her from high school. Well, her shift changed and soon everything the owner agreed to was gone. Not long after I left. Over the next years, I had a few jobs with piece rate. One was at a custom doll factory and the pay matched minimum wage. When the business was sold, all the assemblers were let go. I had job placement through 2DD job agencies over the years with Bob and later through Labor Source. I had to accept subminimum wage at some Labor Source jobs to just have a job. I finally told my team no more. I just want minimum wage or higher, and they found me good jobs. I am waiting now for my turn to have a job coach help me find a job. My pre-pandemic job did not reopen. The things I do to keep busy are fun, but I need a job. The advocacy I have done since 1994 has involved the state legislature and more. I give testimony at hearings every year. I also have made presentations at schools, community groups, college classes, and disability groups local and national. I will now share my testimony to end subminimum wage in Colorado. I am Mike Hoover from Boulder, Colorado. I am a member of the Public Policy Committee of the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council. I am testifying in favor of SB 21-038. The subminimum wage for people with disabilities was intended to use for training only. Up to the present time, there was not an effort to change the employee to competitive wage work, especially in sheltered workshops. I was at a job where I was paid minimum wage, but others who were not disabled complained about my twitching slowing me down. So I was changed to piece rate. My earnings did not go down. The twitching let me focus after an episode. At other jobs, I was paid sub-minimum wage because that is what I was offered. I finally refused the jobs like that because I did not have enough money for the very basic personal things like clothes and haircuts and a movie a few times a year. The dignity of work should include a competitive wage. Please pass this bill. Thank you. I am turning it back to Bob.
Thank you, Michael. Michael's testimony was essential in getting that bill passed. He testified both in the House and Senate as the bill was considered in committee. And as I say, his testimony was essential. So with that, Rachel and Daintry, I think we go to questions and answers. We've got answers, but we need questions.
It looks like Amanda has a question in the chat.
Let's see.
Bob, I think it says, I'll just help it. Did you use any funding to expand work incentives planning or benefits planning services for people with disabilities?
And that's a Colorado question?
I answered it in the chat for Maryland already, so I was just turning it over to you. And Daintry, if you have an answer too, I'll just facilitate this between the two of you for now.
Yeah, for Colorado, we what we did was made sure that vocational rehabilitation put benefits planning into their fee schedule, and the subminimum wage bill put that into the Medicaid HCBS service options, so that of course people oftentimes want to use benefits planning at the front end when they're with VR, vocational rehabilitation, but they're also going to want to see if they change jobs, what's going on with their benefits. And so that's a service that can be now paid for through HCBS or through vocational rehabilitation within people's service plans. So it's no cost to them.
And Bob, you may not have noticed, but yesterday the website went live.
Yes, thank you, Donna. Donna is Mike's communication facilitator. And yeah, DB 101 in Colorado went live yesterday. Thank you. It's a big second day of that for us today.
For Hawaii, our benefits planning is through the Developmental Disabilities Division, through the Medicaid waiver program, as well as our USED, which is our Centers on Disability Studies. And so we are working on enhancing it. This past year, we got our Hawaii ABLE is being implemented. Our Medicaid income disregard is being implemented. And so with also the Indian 14C waivers, all of these are kind of lining up. So we know we have to do a better job with benefits planning. So I appreciate Robert and Rachel's presentation that could guide us a little bit to do a better job.
Great, thank you, Daintry. Craig, I see your hand up.
Yeah, well, having trouble with my camera. This question is for Rachel. Rachel, I was really intrigued by that idea of those TIP grants, and I didn't know if you had any more resources on how those were structured and how providers qualified for those. I think with the recent bump in FMAP and the opportunity to use that for innovative supports and services, that this might be a really great opportunity to use some of those funds to help providers transition from sheltered workshops to a service model that focuses on competitive integrated employment.
Absolutely, we do. So I can, I think I tried to describe that we did sort of a shorter RFP process in terms of what they were required, what the community providers were required to provide. And I'm happy to share that with anyone. I'll put my email in the chat and share the RFP and the questions that were asked of providers. They were then selected, of course, with a review committee made up of the council and Maryland Works, our partner organization, based on the proposal, right? So whether or not the proposed technical assistance, now they didn't know who was going to provide, they did not have to know who was going to provide the technical assistance, but they had to have a real plan and they had to have real buy-in. So one of the things, for example, that we asked is sort of where is everyone in this transformation process? So if it was closing their sheltered workshop, how did people they supported feel? How did families feel? How did the board feel? How did administration feel? How did the direct support professionals feel? And their answers had no indication on whether they were going to get chosen or not. So some of those folks could be not ready at all to make that change, but it gave some idea of, whether we were going to see some real outcomes, right? So Greg, I don't know how to really answer that, but to say I am happy to share the RFP, the application, and any of our reports. We do have like summary reports from year 1, 2, 3, and then we have a full one. If that would be helpful. And I do know a few other councils after ours were released, did in fact release something similar. And I think you're absolutely right with the increase FMAP and the other funds from the rescue plan, that kind of transformation grants are, this is a great opportunity to do things like that through those funds, potentially in partnership with council funds, right?
Right. Yeah, along those lines, we're talking about compliance with the final settings rule.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like a perfect storm.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, the RFP and, the background information reference not only the Equal Employment Act that you heard so much about, but the final settings rule employment first, all of the things that were happening. And of course, when this started 4 years ago, there wasn't as much as we could now reference now, with the new funding and the increase in the FMAP. And so absolutely, I put my email in the chat. If that works for you, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to share any of our materials. I've lost the ability to see everyone. I could see everyone tile, so give me 1 second. All right, now everyone's back. I'm just checking for hands. I don't see any hands, but if anyone wants to type a question in the chat.
I'd just like to say, I think for me, one of my biggest takeaways from all this is the resources we have among each other in all the different states and territories. I really encourage each other to reach out. We have our listservs, or just who you heard today. Great supporting. I met Brett. I didn't really know him beforehand. And then I needed to cry. He was there. He didn't really listen. He just said, like, buck up. This is the way it goes. Just because you get a law passed doesn't mean it's going to get implemented. And that was something else I learned. It's about my 3rd year now being on it. So I just think this is just such a value to understand where we're going. And a lot of times people have already blazed that trail. And it's just sometimes misery loves company, and we have that. And then somebody else has already done that. So I just really appreciate this opportunity to present to you guys, and hearing what Rachel, what they've done and how they're continuing to work on that. And so I know we have another 5 years. Just because we passed it, we have a long ways to go, but it's very exciting to see and how it's working, and having everybody else here for support. So I just wanted to thank everybody for that. Since I only got 5 minutes, I wanted to take up a little bit more of your time. I'm just messing. I'm just joking.
I think you're absolutely right, Daintry, really, right? Some of us have done this, some of us are in process. I'm trying to see if I know where some of the other states are. I'm not sure that I know where everyone's from, but are looking to do this soon. So we are all obviously happy to help in any way that we can. I'm just doing one more scan for hands.
I was going to say that Daintry brings up a really good point on how you can't legislate behavior. And I didn't know if any of the states had any advice on other states on, once you get the legislation passed to eliminate the 14C, how do you impact behavior? For example, Kansas was the first state in the nation to pass employment first legislation. But since that legislation was passed, we actually have fewer people with disabilities engaged in competitive integrated employment than before it passed. So, I didn't know if you guys had any tips or tricks on, moving the needle in that direction once the legislation gets passed.
This is Bob from Colorado, and you're absolutely right. The legislation is the first step. That's why we developed this Employment First Advisory Partnership, to continue to make recommendations to the General Assembly to change things when we see things that need tweaking. And so it is a long game. The legislation is important, but you've got to have true systems change, which means impacting all those things that keep the system from moving forward in a progressive direction.
And Craig, in Maryland, I would say, we use those grants not only to change policies, but to change attitudes and beliefs, and to have those service providers work with wherever the barrier was, right? So whether that's people didn't have the information that they needed to know what jobs were available to them, or whether that meant families were really scared, or whether that meant employers down the street were really scared. And I think that those efforts, and not just through the grants, but because some of those efforts were started to happening, the provider system here in Maryland is very robust, and they do a lot of communication. So they learn those kinds of tricks from one another. And I think that, I sort of always describe it as this double-edged sword, right? That the community is not always ready for people with disabilities to be working because people with disabilities are not working because they don't see them working, right? And so it's this vicious cycle. But I do think that there was a lot of headway made in Maryland just through other efforts and other committees who brought on sort of the unusual suspects, not the typical people, not always just the disability people that work together, but the governor's workforce investment board became really, really interested and really committed to always talking about it with all of the local workforce investment boards. And so I think kind of as we all here started talking about it more and more, different people who weren't normally talking about it started to talk about it. And we, I think that making that kind of concerted effort. So one of the other things we did a whole expectations matter. You see on my, I know it's flipped for me, but behind me on my screen, expectation matter. We did a whole campaign about expectation matter, and it, not just work, but most recently we released 4 grants about expectation matters, and they told us what expectations are raised, and 2 of them focus on employment, right? And so I think that we as the council began to talk about it in terms of expectations, and we focused our social media and our communications around that, just things that we could do. But I will tell you that I do also think some of those unusual suspects getting on board was really helpful here. We do not live in an ideal world here by any means. But I do think that 2 pieces, that the communications around kind of expectations coupled with our work in education, right? And starting those discussions earlier and younger, and working with our State Department of Education to ensure that was huge and continues to be huge. And 2 is talking about it at tables where we aren't normally, or where the people there aren't normally thinking about people with disabilities, to get them thinking about it too.
Also, that's why we had a 4-year phase-out process.
Absolutely. There was a lot to figure out. One of the things that did happen in those 4 years, Ken, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but at the very beginning of that, the state actually changed their person-centered planning process. And for anyone who was working in a sheltered workshop, there was an additional amount of questions and focus around employment and asking about barriers and then addressing those barriers. So when you're talking about specific people, that became part of the process for anyone that was in sheltered work.
If there are no other
Did we
questions at
close
this
the front
time.
door for transition youth?
Absolutely, that's huge. Thank you, Ken. That we did. No one was allowed to go into it as soon as the legislation passed, and so that was the first step. Thank you. Right, I don't see any other questions now.
So thank you all so much for being here. And again, this meeting is being recorded. So early next week, it should be accessible to all of you. And just thank you all again for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.